The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. There was a scholar of the law who stood up to test Jesus and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" He said in reply, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." He replied to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live." But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped him and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with the instruction, 'Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back.' Which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim?" He answered, "The one who treated him with mercy." Jesus said, "Go and do likewise." The Gospel of the Lord.
When I was growing up on good old 166th Street, my neighbors 3 doors to the south were Mr. and Mrs. Lefkowitz. The Lefkowitzes were a retired couple who had no children of their own, and thus no grandchildren of their own. But luckily, they decided that they would adopt us, the kids of the block, including myself, as their grandchildren. This meant for us 2 important things. First, it meant on our block there was 1 more yard to play in. And growing up in New York, space is at a premium. So the extra space means a lot. Second, it meant free food. Mrs. Lefkowitz always kept a tin of cookies at the side door, just waiting for us to come by, and come by we did, often. Frankly, until about the age of 7, Mrs. Lefkowitz was known to my friends and I simply as the Cookie Lady. That's who she was. It was about that same age, 6 or 7, that my friends and I noticed the 5 digits, the 5 numbers that were imprinted on her forearm. We get a peek when she would hold out her hand to give us a cookie, or when she would roll up her sleeves to fix something that we had inevitably destroyed in her garden. There was some considerable conversation between my friends and I as to whether Mr. Lefkowitz had the same thing, because he always wore a button-down shirt with long sleeves, but Sal from across the street swore he saw them once. I have to admit, I can't remember when I came to learn what those numbers meant. that Mr. and Mrs. Lefkowitz had been survivors of the Shoah. But what I do remember was being incredibly confused as to why how some person or group of people could do such terrible things to my neighbors, to some of the most nice people I had met in my life, the two incredibly beautiful people. Today's very familiar gospel narrative starts with a simple question. Who is my neighbor? And it can be easy for us to get caught up in the generosity and kindness of the Samaritan and think that the point and lesson of today's parable is the importance of doing good deeds, which is essential. That's important. Don't get me wrong. But the question, who is my neighbor, suggests that Jesus was trying to highlight a different sort of point, a point about how we understand and see one another. And Christ seems to be making 2 points about being neighbor. The first is shown through the story of the Samaritans. Samaritans were an ethno-religious group that were despised by the Jews of Jesus' time. So great was their disdain that word, the name Samaritan itself, was attached not just to the people of that ethnic heritage, but to any group that the Jews found offensive, heretics, apostates, whatever. Samaritans they all were. Contact with them was strictly forbidden, since they could do no good in the sight of God. Thus, friends, the great turn of the parable is that the Samaritan is not the villain, but the hero. The fact that Jesus would classify a Samaritan as a neighbor would have been shocking to all those around him. In fact, it's interesting, even at the end of the parable, the scholar of the law can't bear to say the word Samaritan. He simply says it's the one who acted with mercy, who is neighbor. The question for us then, of course, is to ask ourselves, who might the Samaritans in our own life be? Who are the ones we presume can do no good? Who are the ones that we are willing to immediately dismiss? Perhaps they watch that other news channel. Perhaps they read that other newspaper. Perhaps they read that other set of blogs. Who are the ones that perhaps because of their race or socioeconomic status make us a little skeptical of their motives and intentions? Perhaps they're the ones who are living lives contrary to the teachings of the gospel or promoting a lifestyle contrary to our very own faith. Perhaps they have actually, in some way, shape, or form, harmed us or wronged us or injured us. Being neighbor doesn't mean ignoring all those things. Being neighbor doesn't mean that pretending those things don't exist. But what being neighbor does mean is that in spite of what separates us, in spite of what divides us, in spite of what injures us to one another, we recognize that each person is capable of bearing the image of Christ. That each and every person is created out of God's love into this world, and as such, must be holy, must bear in some way, shape, or form Christ-likeness. It's the moment we delude ourselves into thinking that there is some aspect of our life that can negate the fact that we were created in God's image, that somehow one's race or ethnicity or immigration status or birth status or even error of belief or criminal activity, that those things somehow make void the love with which God created us. Then, friends, what happened to Mr. and Mrs. Lefkowitz is not all that implausible. The moment we delude ourselves to thinking that somehow someone is worthless, we can justify just about anything. Friends, even the Samaritan, even the most vile of all villains, is capable of exhibiting God's grace and mercy, because they too are God's children. The second point on being neighbor is illustrated through the traveler who's making the trip from Jerusalem to Jericho, a trip that was notoriously dangerous, a road that was filled with robbers and bandits, and this was known to all. You could say that he was foolish, that he should have known better than to travel alone, than to perhaps be carrying too many wares or goods to be attractive to others. Beaten and left for dead, the priest walks by. But he's unwilling to get too close. Because if he is dead and the priest touches him, he'll be unclean and unable to perform his duties in the temple for a week. Better safe than sorry, and walk the other side. The Levite too passes by, and he knows, perhaps, that many robbers play dead, feign injury to lure in potential victims. Was this one of those? Who knows? Better be safe than sorry and pass on the other side. Is it worth the risk of being robbed? Is it worth the risk of ending in the same state? Friends, our gospel reminds us this morning that caring for our neighbor regularly makes us unsafe. It regularly will call us out of our comfort zones and make ourselves vulnerable to others, all for someone who is perhaps even partially responsible for the condition they find themselves in. And yet, God calls us to be neighbor anyway. God calls us to love anyway. God calls us to charity anyway. Because it's in those things that we imitate the love and the charity and the mercy and forgiveness that he exhibits to us by his death and resurrection on the cross. It's our sharing in his divine love, his mercy, his compassion, even when it means sacrifice or vulnerability on our part. That's how Christ invites us into true glory. It's how he invites us to mimic his own life, his own death, but also his own resurrection. And so as we gather around our altar this morning and receive Christ's sacrifice for us, the ultimate pledge of his love in his body and blood and soul and divinity, may our prayer simply be that we have the grace and the courage to be good neighbors, to receive well the sacrifice of love that God gives to us, and seek to share that sacrifice, share that love with each and every person we encounter, for they too are neighbor. They too in some way, shape, or form reflect to us God's life.